So?
So, we have to pull our resources. We have to move fast.
And what resources do you have to pull?
You know how it goes, all those hours, all those experiments. You can get too close to it.
Oh, you think you can do better?
A fresh eye. What's that, beautiful?
You think this is some sort of game, don't you?
What do you mean?
You think this is a playground and I've got the ball? Go and tell the teacher that bad girl won't let us play with her ball. But there is no teacher. This isn't a game. Little boys? You're all just little boys. Go and play with your little boys. I am not a little boy. I don't like your game, and I won't play.
Oh, wow.
Hello, Jim. Science has always been a man-only activity, and even if you were a great scientist like Rosalind Franklin, things were tough at the top. And Fausto Sterling, does science have an explanation as to why science has been so unfriendly to women?
I don't think science does have an explanation, although they've tried for hundreds of years to find explanations. And I think maybe this clip on the history of Darwin and his views about women might help us start out talking about this. But there's a long history of women, of people trying to talk about women.
Average ability, women can never be outstanding, started with Darwin.
The chief distinction in the intellectual powers of the two sexes is shown by man's attaining to a higher eminence in whatever he takes up than can woman, whether requiring deep thought, reason, imagination, or merely the use of the senses and hands.
Evolutionary theory was used to justify the supposed mediocrity of women.
Recent evidence has shown that education dries up a woman's reproductive organs as she learns more and more. Higher education will produce flat-chested women unable to suckle their babies.
Well, I think what one sees in that tape, exemplified by Darwin, but every major scientist of Darwin's period and well into the, I would say, the middle of the 20th century, held views of that sort about women and tried various ways to bring biology to bear as proof of their viewpoints. I would say that Darwin and the Victorian scientists and the ones who followed afterwards also constantly intermingled their views about women with their views about race.
Well, I mean, what we were hearing there, Anne, sounded like a load of male prejudice. Surely they had some more evidence upon which to base their conclusions.
They published all sorts of papers. They published papers on brain size. They published papers on what happens to women's ovaries. They produced what counted as evidence in their period. And the thing is that it's easy for us with hindsight to laugh and say, isn't that silly? But then when we have similar kinds of things coming out today, we say, oh, well, today we're not being silly. Today this stuff is real because now it's being done with proper, real techniques.
Ian Stewart, will they laugh? I mean, can we make this nice distinction between the scientific bunkum of the past, which is just entertaining, and the claims that are being made nowadays about biological distinctions between the male and the female? Is that something that people will indeed, as Anne suggests, be laughing at in 10 years' time, 50 years' time?
I think so. Some people are laughing at it now. I think it's our
around
own,
this table, I guess.
It's our own scientific bunkum. The problem is that there are sensible scientific investigations which are actually finding genuine things, but there's this cultural overlay, and we're suffering from it just as much as they did in the past. The proof of the inferiority of women involved measuring the size of their brains, and women on average have smaller brains than men. This is, of course, because women are on average smaller than men themselves. There was this big assumption that the size of your brain was actually important. But I think this is right. The man who did a lot of this, Broca, after his death they measured the size of his brain, and it was smaller than the average woman's brain from his own experiments.
I think the point is a very important one, that looking at the 19th century science, or even some of the studies today, we have to take them as a real attempt for the time. I mean, a serious attempt to explain what are, if you like, observed differences in men and women. The fundamental difference, which we must remember, is that there is an essential genetic component of all the neurons which determines sex, as there is in all cells in the body. And that may not have grave functional effects, but nevertheless it is there. If we then take what is the organisation of structure, I think the important thing is that looking at the brain, there is a great deal of commonality across race, throughout age, and certainly across sex.
I don't think that everybody out there, myself especially, agrees with your accounting of what counts as a real account of the brain. For example, just even what you said about genes, the genetic difference of cells in the brains when we know that there's this intense flexibility about human development that means that we can raise people who have Y chromosomes in all of their cells as females, and they will, with the exception of reproduction, be perfectly competent as females in the world.
You seem to me to be actually going so far as to say there are no biologically based sex differences upon which gender can then be a construction.
I think that by and large, I do believe that, yes.
Well, that just does seem to me to be an extraordinary statement that flies in the face of all of the evidence.
Well,
there may be one or two exceptional cases which you
think
could
that the evidence is all extremely weak and circumstantial, and that's where we could argue at some length.
But I think we have to be cautious how we interpret a biological difference, even if we find one. Now, it turns out that a mouse has a higher density of brain cells than a human does. So even if brains are different in size, what can we actually infer from that? I think we ought to be very careful.
Mice are much cleverer than
about,
men.
Indeed, how we interpret the data, even if the data does exist.
It turns out that women have a higher density than men do, too, for whatever the studies are worth.
But density of neurons in their own don't tell us everything we need to know about brain function. It's the connections between the neurons.
Furthermore, we're getting locked into too much thinking about things, not the processes those things are carrying out.
So even if we do have differences...
That's right.
On from that, Susan, I mean, do we make a big fuss about the differences? The interesting thing is historically when the big fuss is made, when biology starts speaking very loudly into the culture, talking about the inferiority of this, that, or the other group. I mean, usually, the marked others are women, they are black people, and they're often children. And these are seen as not autonomous subjects, they're people to be kept in the private space, and that the public world of science must be controlled by men. Now, those happen when you get a strong feminist movement at the late 19th century battering to get into education. And then you've got this wonderful effusion from the life sciences making these wonderful claims. I mean, that as it were, a little thought wrecks your reproductive system.
I'm not disagreeing with you. All I'm saying is we have to be cautious about differences if we find them.
Oh,
That's all I'm saying. I'm not in any way saying we shouldn't
I think
explore differences, but we should just be cautious how we interpret them.
Well, I think that's a very negative approach. I think you ought to go out looking for differences, and you ought to go into brains and find out why a woman's brain differs from a man's. Look for it, on the presumption that it does, because then you can fan it into something wonderful. You're looking for variety in the world, and you should go out and you should try to make the world as different as you can.
Why would you?
Because then because then you enrich the world. Whereas your sort of politically motivated, culturally conditioned approach to science is to bring everything together, and I find that the most depressing attitude to the world.
I totally endorse that point of view. Let's just go back to the question of brains being different. The brain can be made different by early experience. It doesn't have to be genes that make it different. It is, in the last analysis, irrelevant to the issues of why and how, if there are sex differences, they come to be that way, that the brain should be different. It is very important to know whether or not the brain is different, because that is the organ that mediates all of the things we're talking about. But the pattern of the data has been the same for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. It's the same in every country where it's been looked for. It's the same across the lifespan. It's nothing to do with superiority or inferiority. It is everything to do with what Peter has just talked about, diversity. And everybody, I should think, around the table knows what I'm going to say. On average, it's always on average, the mean score of women on tests of verbal ability is higher than that for men. On average, the mean score on tests of visuospatial ability is higher for men than it is for women. Now, both of these patterns of ability, and they're not the only factors, there are other factors like what men and women on average are interested in. From a very early age, males are more interested in things, women in people. And we now have a science of people. We have a science of people called psychology. We have a lot of biology, where being interested in individual members of a species, your own or another species, is tremendously important. It's no accident. There are a lot of very, very eminent women in the biological sciences.
But if women are more interested in people, then why is there not a majority of women biologists? Why is there not a majority of English language professors if women have better verbal ability than men?
That's another issue. Could we just finish this one? Because I think that is a very important but a slightly different issue. The pattern of abilities is different, and therefore your being a physicist, as you know, is a very rare thing in the sense that there are very few women who've achieved very high eminence in physics. When a woman comes...
There is no evidence that it's because I think differently, that my brain patterns are different.
There is evidence that on average, women have the abilities that make for good physics less than do men. On average, they have the abilities that make for other things more than men.
I disagree. The evidence is scanty.
I could, if this were that kind of thing, bring out a string of citations.
Yes, and I could critique each one in turn and take them apart. So
because you have a political agenda.
Yeah, suppose you did the same study. Suppose you did the same study in a different culture.
So you get the same result. It's been done in at least. I was reading yesterday a paper where it was done in 10 different countries, and they're not all in Europe. Why do you get worried that I say there is a pattern of different abilities? Nobody around the table is getting hot under the collar and saying, why aren't the boys as good as the girls at doing verbal things?
Because this is just the point that she made. When the boys don't do as well as the girls on verbal things, it doesn't seem to get in the way of their getting jobs, promotion, going into higher education, getting, getting teaching positions, all of those sorts of things. But every time someone says the girls aren't as good as someone, it's seen as a reason for their not getting advanced. And what that means is that reasons that many of us see get ignored, and the main ones around them are discrimination at every level of the educational system, at every level of hiring, at every level of promotion, and active discouragement of girls to go into particular areas.
I'd like to throw something in between the two of you. You're talking about disciplines in which women are not active. You used physics as an example, used it to support your particular argument. Take a very interesting and American example, obstetrics and gynecology. That's an area of medicine where 10, 15 years ago, 90% of the OBGYN specialists were men. Yeah. Right now, this has shifted tremendously. 50% at least of all the residents are now women, and I predict in another 20 years you're going to find out 80% of the OBGYN. Well, there you see a clear cultural discrimination.
Because there's no lack of ability there. On the contrary, women probably have the abilities to a much greater degree
but
than
if we're therefore going to be talking about discrimination of women in science or the absence of women in certain disciplines, then we better address ourselves right away to these, as you said, for instance, cultural factor. You're talking about a clip. May I show you an English clip here in this case here?
Please do, if our miracle technology is going to work.
Well, because this really supports...
Well, we've all got equal ability, and I don't think it's really right, you know, that they say science is just for boys. But now that we've been in here for nearly a year, well, I think the boys think that, you know, we can both do it.
When we came to the questions about the science and what do boys think about girls going into science, most of the boys said that it wasn't a women's job, and so they just thought that girls weren't intelligent enough to do that sort of work.
Well, some of the boys said girls can't do engineering in this class. What would you say to them?
Well, they can, because we've both got equal ability and everything. It's just, I think boys are more encouraged to do, like, engineering jobs.
It's very encouraging to see that clip. They believe something which is very important for their own selfhood, for their own likelihood of success, and for their future. This was not true 15 years ago, when I did a study of girls' and boys' attitudes to science, and I found one of the most important things was that girls found science difficult, and this put them off. Boys saw art subjects, girls' subjects, as easy, and that put them off. And this was a very powerful factor at that time, I think, in demotivating girls.
I shall say only politically incorrect things today, I think, because it's the only way I can make any progress on this question. And I think the politically incorrect thing to say is that maybe we should discourage girls from doing particular things, just as we should discourage boys. if we knew more about the way the brain worked, and if we knew what particular skills were, then, and in particular individual cases, not just these global statistical views,
Peter, I'm a little puzzled.
Then we should discourage people from entering them. If we knew that a particular girl did not have very good spatio-temporal imagination, then we perhaps would discourage her from becoming a geometer.
Peter, do you know the history, though,
But she might,
of, for example,
because
the common
in this
entrance
kind of
examination?
environment that we were seeing on the screen, where all these little girls were being encouraged to say they're jolly good at physics, so they were going to do physics, I think is a very dangerous way of manipulating people.
But the opposite is
the
true.
manipulation has occurred for 40 years, in which the results of the 11+ examinations, which were a great chunk of it were IQ testing, very psychological, very scientific, that for 40 years the results were the girls were brighter than the boys. And it was simply, I mean, an unacceptable scientific result.
But
So
don't you now want to introduce a 50-50 positive structural discrimination to make sure that exactly half as many there are exactly 50% of girls doing physics? I thought that was the feminist agenda.
If we take,
everybody is deliberately assuming that differences mean inequalities. There's a differential.
That's a really important. I think
pattern
Jeffrey's
of
making a
ability.
really important point. That there's differences.
Well, look at this.
It's our attitudes to those differences that we need to talk about,
Exactly.
not whether differences exist, because they're proven they exist.
Now, if we go back to the Darwin clip, you've got to look at it in a much broader context. What else is happening? He's not just describing women in a particular way. A lot of other things are happening in the society at the same time. There's, for example, the poor law is coming up, and the poor are treated in a specific way. And he's saying very similar things about the poor as well. But more important, there's empire going on at the same time. And a lot of the notions of the ideal European women actually come from the empire and not so much from Britain.
Why are the boys nasty, Vicky?
'Cause they fight.
Ooh. What are you going to be when you grow up?
A soldier.
A soldier? Why?
I will. I like to be
This is too good to be true, isn't it? Yeah.
a train driver. No, I really want to be a cooker.
I'm sure there are those that will say that these kids have all been framed by Machiavellian parents
Child
or
actresses,
manipulate
aren't they?
all their actresses. But to my mind, they were speaking from the heart. And I think it's very interesting, to take up Jeffrey's point, that clearly there are differences in their attitudes. Now, whether it's good or bad, what we do about it, of course, is a separate issue of debate, but I don't think we can deny that clearly differences exist.
I think we can ask where they come from.
The jump is, you know, where does that is? I mean, it's where does it come from? Because, you know, I mean, from those studies of if you give babies wrapped in pink and blue, people handle them differently and play much more bouncing games with them if they're in blue. And, you know, when you unwrap them...
Hillary, can I ask a simple question? Do you want there to be differences, or do you want there to be no differences?
I want human diversity. What I can't stand is this dichotomous reasoning that there is in the world this sort of enormous difference between women and men. What interests me is the diversity in the whole of humanity, which, as it were, you can't even begin to sort of get into when you're sort of obsessed with this sort of peculiar dichotomous reasoning.
But there are statistical differences.
Jeffrey, look, there are statistical differences.
They're very large ones. I don't just mean a tiny one. We're talking about people who achieve serious scientific eminence. There should be, and there are, a lot of female biologists. There are a lot of female psychologists. In my own field, there are as many women as men working in my very own field at the Maudsley. There are far more women than men. And in those fields, you see plenty of women doing brilliant work, but there are areas of science where you would expect, as there are, to be a smaller number of women. What I would like to know is, why do you all on the, shall we say, the feminist side of the divide, just for the sake of giving it a label, why is it always assumed that you start from the male value pattern, right? Because the males are better at the physics, it's got to be the physics that the women have got to charge into, rather than say, maybe we should take the things that women are good at as being at least of equal value as male, and possibly better.
But
you're conniving.
The basic point is that male values are ingrained within the framework of science.
That's not the case.
That is absolutely the case throughout history,
Right,
and even more so now.
But is the argument here that there is a sort of natural structure to the sciences, and some sciences are more women-friendly, not for political reasons, but for intellectual reasons than others are? I mean, is that a position, Susan, that you'd want to accept?
There's some branches of science which I could dub the magic bullet branches of science, where perhaps there's a reductionist answer that's more easy to find than, for example, in my own area, which is the brain, which naturally is a very open-ended area because you have to consider factors that you can't identify, and you have to be comfortable with a complex situation where you can't identify every factor pertaining to a situation. Other branches of science are more magic bullet because we know more about
So,
them.
as it were, Geoffrey would be saying that the mathematical sciences are men-friendly. Susan is saying that the simplifying sciences are men-friendly. If you want a quick fix...
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that perhaps a woman
I think
might feel more
that's
comfortable.
pandering to the stereotypes, isn't it?
No, I'm just saying that some people, perhaps the women, are more comfortable intellectually with not necessarily being able to know everything automatically all at once, and might be able to live with this uncertainty and actually enjoy it and explore it and play around with it. With other people's attitudes are to try and find a single answer.
This is the paradox of the human condition, one that fits him to all environments. His imagination, his reason, his emotional subtlety and toughness make it possible for him not to accept the environment, but to change it. And that series of inventions by which man from age to age has remade his environment is a different kind of evolution, not biological, but cultural evolution. I call that brilliant sequence of cultural peaks the ascent of man.
Right, that was Jacob Bronsky introducing the ascent of man, which is the ascent of science. In fact, I think in this program he kind of starts off laying out the connection between science and history and science and culture. And to a very large extent, it is a male culture presenting a white Anglo-Saxon male view of science, which are very, very deeply ingrained. Now, it's very interesting looking at Clip, the metaphors he uses. Reason is he. Nature is definitely her. And in the whole construction of the piece, there is this division in his own mind that it is man who is going to go out and conquer, and it is, if you like, the female metaphor, which is the subject of conquest.
It's absolutely clear, and goes right back to Bacon in the 17th century, writing about the new philosophy, the new science, used metaphors of man conquering or seducing or even raping nature in order to get her to yield up her mysteries, and which will be of use to man. It's explicit very much there, and it carries right through in science, in the development of science ever since then.
So
and we still carry with it.
So the argument that Zia and Helen are putting forward is that there is something in the way we think of the nature of science which makes it congenial for men to succeed in it, and women are always regarded as somehow or other knocking on the door. But science is masculine and somehow nature is female.
Let's make
an
argument against this. But it might help to address this issue, Roy, if we just try to say what is science. And I know that you can talk about
what
this.
I wanted.
I know you can talk about this for days and days and days, but I want to propose something really very, very simple. Science, and this is not scientists, it's the discipline of science, is that area of our intellectual inquiry where all ideas are possible, but all must pass or fail a test of empirical observation. Straightforward, simple as that. If you're dealing with ideas where you're going to knock them out if they don't pass that test, that's science. Doesn't matter what kind of ideas, and it also doesn't matter what kind of methods you use in order to test the observations. It can be astronomical, it can be microscopical, it can be testing behavior or whatever. Now, if you take that view of science, absolutely no reason why one should contemplate the possibility that, on average, men and women should be different in their capacity to do that.
Anne, You have a clip to show us on, is this Islamic science?
This is one of the clips on Islamic science.
Khilafah says that we are God's trustees on earth. In other words, scientists should respect nature, not destroy it.
We are thinking of how, instead of using more expensive and environmentally dangerous insecticides, pesticides, and fertilizers, how we can turn to some of the more benign type of methodologies. For instance, by taking biotechnology on and creating nitrogen-fixing symbiotic bacteria.
The point of showing this is to again raise the question of whether what we call Western science is really in fact a particular kind of ethnoscience that can be in fact compared to other scientific traditions around the world, not as necessarily better, but rather as the particular outcome of our culture. Now I would suggest that one of our principles that we've injected into our science is this notion of kind of hyper-objectivity and the pretense that science has no cultural content, that is a peculiarity of European and Euro-American thought, and in that
sense, outrageously misleading.
It's also that, isn't it?
This is an outrageous example of this. I mean, I don't understand how you can say that this man, I mean, has a temerity of claiming that this is he's talking about nitrogen fixation, getting away from pesticides, and saying that the Islamic science? I mean, for God's sake, this is what we're all trying to do now. I mean, to go and credit that. This is like, if you're going to give this a cultural or ethnic or political imprint, then we better talk about Marxist science. You know, that's how they did science.
I think there has been quite a major shift, and I think Anne's point, whether it's a matter of ethnicity or culture or whatever, there has been one way of looking at...
But this is not the example. This is not the example.
The example you're giving is of another way of looking at science, but it isn't confined to the dimensions of ethnicity. It's also a historical thing. But you're absolutely right to say that we've been stuck with a particular view that to achieve the goals that Jeffrey's defined, which is getting knowledge tested, getting knowledge advanced, you have to go about things in one particular way, one particular model of rationality, one particular way of doing science, one particular way of thinking about the world.
Has anybody come up with another one? One which doesn't look at
Jeffrey, let me finish, because I'm going to argue that what's been happening, and this example that we've just seen of concern about what we in the West we call green issues, there are a number of strands in the last 15, 20, maybe longer years, of people saying, hey, wait a minute, maybe some of our assumptions about how we go about science, and even some of our assumptions about how things function, might be inadequate for the science we are pursuing. For example, we've had Darwinian competition for a very long time. Nowadays we have people like Lynn Margulis, particularly the microbiologists in the States, and other people working with a model of evolution having a strong cooperative element. Now, this is quite a major shift, because you're shifting the assumptions underpinning how we think about evolution, and it's damn good science. It's so appalling. This is
David, the doctor!
That's all the woman did, or the girl in it did. Scream and scream and scream.
I'm your new assistant. I took general science at A-level.
I'm sure you did, but even so.
It could be Mars or Venus, but whatever he may...
Later on, she made a silly blunder, and he said,
I thought you took an A-level in science.
Didn't say I passed. Ugh, an octopus.
Look, Joe, why don't you go and get out of that ridiculous garb?
Okay. Actually, I think this is distressing, seeing these clips, because this stuff went out to girls between 8 and 16. For a whole generation of girls learnt about some of the science fiction aspects of science through this very popular programme. And they are all cast in sort of silly little nymphette styles, and furthermore, they're always screaming. The other thing you find in the representations of women in science fiction, which is a very important source of information to the general public about science, is that women stand there and scream, and the scientist hero brings his rationality to bear and rescues her. And this is, as Deborah Watling said in this thing, she spent the whole year screaming, and that's basically her role.
For me, the real problem, and I think this is the one that can be addressed, is as the junior person you're suppressed, and this can happen to both men and women, and that we haven't spoken yet of all the good ideas that could have happened, all the good experiments that could have been done, that were written off because the boss couldn't tolerate a younger person having an idea that he or she hadn't had, probably he hadn't had. The second issue, which I think is particularly applicable to women, is the degree of patronisation that occurs. When you're a woman starting off as a graduate student, you're not aware of this because a graduate student is the lowest form of life anyway. So you don't know whether it's because you're a woman or because you're a graduate student. But as you get older, and a man perhaps persists more in trying to patronise you whereas they wouldn't to a man, that's when it starts to...
If a mentor has both a male graduate student and a female graduate student, who they're likely to think of just on the spot spontaneously if they get a phone call saying, hey, we're looking for a bright young person for the job, then who comes to mind first? Many people may mentor women through the graduate career, but not think of them seriously as people who will be able to head laboratories.
Exactly.
And so in the U.S., the big dropping point right now in biology is taking that step from postdoc to heading a laboratory, and you will find many more males heading laboratories than females in biology. There's a huge dropout rate of women at the postdoc level now in the U.S.
I'd just like to expose some of the assumptions that are behind not only the whole of this discussion, but behind this discussion when it occurs in every context, not just the science context. It's taken for granted that what used to be regarded as an important female value, namely bringing up baby, is less important than what used to be regarded as a typical male value, that is doing well out in this case, the laboratory or in industry or in politics or whatever. Now, maybe that is indeed the way society wants to order its values, but it's not obvious that parenting is the thing that we should consider last.
I think that's quite interesting as a psychologist that you should have those views, because obviously you believe that those are scientifically founded.
I believe,
although
I believe the data are quite clear that there are patterns of differences in individual emotional ability, and there's no question whatsoever that females are more sensitive to other people's emotions, they're better able to identify other people's emotions, they're much more interested on average in people, they are specialised to be in much closer contact with children than are males. Males have only entered the game of child rearing since humans developed from the great apes only a few million years ago.
Not
wait a minute, do the women in this audience regard bringing up baby as unimportant and unrewarding?
I don't know why you feel that you have the right to ask that. It seems to me the most interesting question to ask about so many men scientists is their terrible history of having children whom they massively neglect, and as it were the sort of failure of men scientists to take their responsibilities as parents seriously.
I still want to go back to the issue of values. If women, when we see fewer girls than boys doing physics, the assumption is it must be tremendously rewarding to do physics, and why are the girls not being allowed in to do it? When we see more women than men being parents, the assumption is it's terribly nasty to do parenting. I don't understand.
For one thing, men get paid to do physics, and women don't get paid to do childcare in anything like the... we're talking about...
So suggest paying
I think we should bring this back to a
and you'd
very
have men wanting to do it.
From a few million years ago to the future, in what sort of ways are we? Do we think that science is actually going to be transforming our notion of the nature of woman as a biological creature, the nature of woman as a social creature?
I think it won't transform it unless we start having a lot more, not only women scientists, but women scientists who have women's interests as a key component of what they want to be doing. In other words, science has traditionally simply reconstructed the notions that Jeffrey's put forth, and it will continue to do that forever as long as it's primarily men making those stories.
Well, that's chicken and egg, isn't it? I mean, where's it going to start?
Yes, it is chicken and egg.
Yes.
It is chicken and egg. Yes.
If you look at the feminist primatologists, what they are doing is constructing an account of the relationship between mother monkeys and their babies, which actually uses the central metaphor which women use who are mothers, and that is of juggling. And that the way that the mother monkey manages taking care of the baby, foraging, and protecting the baby from other sort of dangers is actually a question of mixing a whole lot of activities. And what she's doing is she's taking a model of this is how women are in our society, and she's looking in nature and she's reflecting back a much friendlier picture to women. But I mean, what has historically happened, and when people like Geoffrey do it, is they look into nature and they produce a mirror image which is entirely friendly to men. And each of them regards
But it's only friendly to men if you think parenting is a terrible value and a terrible thing to have to do.
Diane was the first scientist to be totally accepted by the gorillas.
Slowly, over the years, all the animals of Group 4 were approaching very closely, simply because of their own initiative and the sense of curiosity. To have finally been accepted by the wild gorillas was its own reward, and the thrill of each day's contact is one that will never diminish.
But I wanted to pick up Hilary's point about the way that female primatologists have looked at female primate behaviour, because they are deliberately saying what's being left out of the male story, are enlarging our science, enlarging our understanding, because they're saying we must take not only the masculinist view, but also the feminine, not necessarily only feminist view. And this is enlarging our science. It's also bringing it into the culture, because it means that our culture is no longer going to regard science, as it has done for so long, as a kind of cold, rational, often rather dangerous activity done by men in white coats. We're now beginning to say that maybe our science becomes more culture-friendly, not just to little girls growing up, but to the wider culture.
That is a very good example, but a very famous one for how women have a very different perspective at a science which until fairly recently, until you had the Jane Goodall, etc. Group, Diane Fossey, was a male discipline as well. But try and do this in math, try and do it even in physics.
Well, we have a mathematician here. Let's listen to him then. Ian.
Yes, it's given the conventional view of how mathematics goes as the most abstract, intellectual, etc. part of human activity in science, it might seem that introducing these feminine values, so to speak, would be very difficult, but actually it's happening. Firstly, there's a lot more women mathematicians now than there used to be, and it's growing very fast. But mathematics itself, even mathematics, is not culturally neutral. There's the whole question of what kind of questions do you ask, at what level do you look at the subject. There's an enormous growth of biomathematics, for example. This is using standard mathematical tools and forging new ones to look at biological problems, problems about the environment, problems about evolution. And I think there is a lot of room for importing a kind of more holistic view, if you wish, a higher level view. And so this traditionally male approach of doing very, very complicated calculations on a very abstract level is definitely being supplanted in some respects by what seems to be a more feminist sort of thing.
Yes, another area, I think, which is a hard science area also, is neurophysiology, which is my area. Again, you're hampering yourself if you're after just one answer, one villain. For example, the cause of Parkinson's disease, the one horrible substance, the one terrible event. The more you can entertain and be comfortable with an open-ended situation that's more like a house of cards,
that's right,
then the better you are at that particular subject.
We have a clip here that can come in.
It's beautiful, Francis.